Aperture. We're finally talking about aperture. It's my favorite. But what is it? It's a little mysterious and there's some science involved, but I'll break it down in simple terms here, and once you know what it means and how to use it, it can become the most important part of your photography. And Bill and I are going to go on location in Disney World and show you some real-world examples. And at the end of the video, I'll tell you why aperture is the first thing I consider when composing a photograph. So if you ever wondered what that F/number thing meant, or how it affected your photos, this is the video for you. This one's going to be fun. I can't wait! Aperture literally means opening, and it refers to the width of the opening in your lens. Now you can open or close that opening to change the amount of light that passes through to your sensor, which means that aperture plays a huge role in determining your exposure. The other main component of that is shutter speed. We cover that in another video. So for purposes of this video, we're going to concentrate on aperture and how you can control it and how it affects your photo. Now the aperture is expressed in f-stops. You don't really need to know the math involved, but basically it's the ratio between your focal length and the width of the opening in your lens. Again, you don't really need to know the math behind it. The f-stop numbers will become more like labels once you get to know them. A very wide or open aperture would be indicated by a small number like f1.4, f2.0, f2.8. A larger number like f16 or f22 would indicate a small aperture. And you can control that aperture by putting your camera into aperture priority mode, indicated by AV. So let's take a look inside the lens to see exactly what we're talking about. Here we are looking into a lens and the aperture is currently set at 1.4, a very wide aperture. You may have heard a term like shooting wide open, and that's what this means. The lens is open as much as possible. Another term you've probably heard is stopping down, and that is where you are closing down your aperture to a smaller opening. So let's stop down this lens from f1.4 to f2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16. Each of these is considered one full stop. You can see how the blades inside the lens close to create a smaller opening. You should know that for every one stop that you open the aperture, you double the amount of light passing through to the sensor. So if you go from f4 to f2.8, twice as much light is allowed through the lens. Conversely, if you close the aperture down by one stop, let's say from f4 to f5.6, you cut that amount of light in half. Now the reason that you want to control your aperture is very important. The aperture not only affects the amount of light passing through, but it also affects the depth of field. The depth of field refers to the amount of the photograph that is in focus. This is great for portraits where you want to get a nice shot of your subject isolated from the background. While Bill and I were down in Disney World recently, we were at the boardwalk and the lighting and the mood were perfect for talking about aperture and how it affects your portraits. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so we're still here at the boardwalk and we're still talking aperture. The lighting is really nice. The backdrop is the boardwalk itself, which is really beautiful. I'm going to show you some examples of how aperture affects the portrait photograph and how it affects the background and how things really look overall. I'm going to run through a series of photographs starting at f8.0 all the way down to f1.4, and you'll see exactly from shot to shot how the background changes and how the whole look of the photograph changes. So Bill is my subject again. He's very cooperative. We're going to get a look at all of these shots of him and you're going to see what the difference really is. So I'm going to start at 8.0, focusing on the eyes. 5.6, 4.0, 2.8, 2.0, 1.4. And you can see the background basically melt away. You know, at f8.0, the building behind Bill was in sharp focus. The people walking past were in focus. It was a very busy background. It looked nice, but it was busy. Once you get all the way down to 1.4, the background is just a nice soft blur. All the attention is focused on Bill, and it really makes a really nice portrait. That lens I was using was this.
What'd you think? I'm a pretty good model, huh? Maybe a second career.
All right. That lens I was using was the Sigma 50mm art lens. Bill and I both use it. It's a really great lens. I put a link to it in the description below. I suggest you check it out. So that's a great example of how you want to use a wide aperture to get a shot with a shallow depth of field. Perfect for portraits. A smaller or narrow aperture like f11 or f16 will result in a greater depth of field, where you can get a photograph where your main subject in the foreground is in focus and the background is also in focus. This is great for landscapes. Let's look at a real-time example of a photograph and how changing the aperture changes the depth of field and the overall look of the photo. So you can see here, I'm starting wide open at f1.4 and just my main subject is in focus. Now, maybe that's what you want, and that's okay. I kind of like it. But let's stop down to see how the image changes as the aperture gets smaller. You can see how the rest of the image starts to come into focus as we stop down, and now everything is sharp. Keep in mind that as we change the aperture, the camera is compensating for the exposure by automatically adjusting the shutter speed. That's pretty cool, huh? I told you I'm an aperture junkie. My camera is almost always in aperture priority mode. It really is one of the most two important parts of composing every photograph. The other part being your focal length, but I can't talk about aperture and lenses in one day. It's just too much. It's too much excitement. So we've seen how the aperture controls the depth of field. You can use a wide open aperture, get a shallow depth of field, isolate your subject against a blurred background. You can use a small, narrow aperture, get everything in sharp focus, and there's many things that you can do in between there also. But take your camera out and try taking shots at all different aperture settings. Remember, I always recommend shooting every day, even if you don't have time. Just take 5 minutes, take your camera out, find something in your house, a flower, some other object to take a picture of, use different settings, try different apertures of the same shot, see how it affects the look of the photograph. The more you use your camera and the more you understand how the settings affect the photograph, the easier it's going to be to learn and to take that out into the real world when you're actually shooting. So thanks for following me along on my aperture journey. I hope you like this video. Give it a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. You'll get other videos like this. And of course, if you have any questions or anything that you want to tell us, post them in the comments below. We always love to hear from you. So thanks again for watching. We'll see you in the next video. Shots where we've focused, I don't want to say all the way through.